Welcome to Hope Blooms, a podcast from the Early Pregnancy Loss Association.
At EPLA, we seek to support women and families suffering early pregnancy loss by providing resources, education, and community. It is our vision that no one suffers miscarriage alone.
Welcome back to Hope Blooms. I am EPLA's President, Maria Servold.
And I am EPLA's Executive Director, Emily Carrington.
Today, we have a very special guest. We have Linda Tibbetts, who happens to be Emily's mom, and she's going to talk with us today about her own loss and also what it's like to experience miscarriage as a grandma. So welcome. Thank you for joining us, Linda.
Thanks for having me here today.
Yes, so she's also one of our founding board members.
Yes.
And remains on the board. So she has been involved for a long time as my mom, and as not just as my mom, but
right from the very beginnings of our organization,
overseeing this happening. So let's just get started with your story of miscarriage and your own experience of miscarriage a few years ago.
Yes, quite a few years ago. In 1986, to be exact, I was 27 years old and was very excited to be starting a family with my husband, Dave. Found out that we were pregnant and we were starting to make plans. We were starting to make purchases. And I got up one morning and the bleeding had started. I was terrified. Of course, that was pre-internet. So I couldn't get on and start searching and saying what is happening to my body. So I called my doctor immediately and he said, come over. He said, don't panic. It's not always a bad thing. And when I got there, he did an exam and he said, I'm sorry. We're going to lose this pregnancy. And I remember just being numb and not really knowing anyone that had been through that and wasn't really sure who to talk to. Wasn't really sure what to do. And he provided me with, my options. Back in the day, he gave me some medication to increase cramping and to make sure everything was complete. And then he had me come back for an exam to see if I needed a DNC, which I did not. But I remember being in a lot of pain. I remember being very miserable and very upset. So, of course, I went to family and none of my family had experienced that. And the reaction was kind of like, oh, there's worse things. It's no big deal. You'll be fine. That wasn't particularly satisfying. And it wasn't until I had a friend come to me that had experienced it that said, Linda, this is a really faceless grief. That I thought, thank you. You see me, you hear me. I'm not alone. But I had a rough summer. My husband was in graduate school then, and we would move to campus in the summers. He was a teacher, and we would move to campus in the summers. And I was very lonely. And I remember searching the college library, and I remember walking downtown to the public library, just looking for material. Again, there was no internet, and just looking for material. And the only thing I could find was a sentence in a medical book that said about 20% of pregnancies ended in miscarriage, and thinking, how can something be so common and so unspoken?
Right. I mean, it's amazing that even in your family, no one had anything, and you'd think sort of with the 20% that would have at least shown up there.
Someone.
But,
yeah. And I just remember the dismay. I remember being told it was just purely disappointment and thinking, this is bigger than that. This is a loss. I've lost a life. I'm grieving. So then, do you want me to fast forward then 30 years later?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So I did have two children. I had two girls, one actually the following year and one 4 years later, and raised them. And we fast forward to 2014, and my oldest daughter, Emily, who is our founder, we were so excited that she and Adam were pregnant, and I couldn't wait to be a grandma. And honestly, the thought of miscarriage hadn't even crossed my mind. I had clearly healed and wasn't living in fear. And I remember not being able to tell my friends that I was going to be a grandma, and I couldn't wait till she had her 12-week exam so that I could tell the world that I was going to be a grandma. I was so excited. And I was in an area restaurant, and I got the phone call, and the only words I heard were no heartbeat. And I couldn't fathom it. I couldn't fathom what she was saying to me. And I remember just two layers of grief hitting me like a wave of, I'm not going to be a grandma. I can't tell my friends. They don't even know she was pregnant. What am I going to do? And then the other wave of, oh, my daughter. She's going through what I went through. Oh my goodness, the pain. How do I support my daughter?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember telling family and those who had loss, I remember them crying, and others still didn't get it.
And it probably, did it sort of did those feelings from your own experience sort of come back
Absolutely.
up? Yeah.
Absolutely. They all came rushing back up, and they're not feelings you ever want your children to experience.
Right. I know. Oh, and that's a whole new layer. It's like any pain that we don't ever want our children to suffer, and then to watch them go through something that you went through to know how hard it is particularly rough.
Right.
Yeah.
And being the eternal optimist, I thought, well, this is 30 years later. They're going to handle it so much better. She's going to walk away with information. She has the internet.
That makes everything better.
Yeah, stay away from that. She's going to have compassionate doctors that understand. And my doctor wasn't cold. The coldest thing I remember was him saying, I remember sitting in his office and saying, I don't want to have this happen again. What can I do? I was blaming myself. And he said, well, Linda, you're going to need to go through this 3 times before we do any testing. And I said, I can't do it. And he said, you have no idea what you can do. And thinking, well, yeah, I do. Make it stop.
Yeah.
Of course, hindsight.
Right. Like, don't put this horrible benchmark in front of me that I have to meet. Yeah.
It was terrifying. And then I remember chatting with her, and really the scene hadn't changed very much. They didn't hand her information. She did have the internet, but it was not a healthy place to go. And, this was 9 years ago. So the climate was different than it is now.
But still shocking that in the 21st century, things were not that much better, right?
No, and then the recommendation still was, 3 miscarriages before
any testing.
And I think it's interesting that recently, and we talked about this, that study from the UK government, one of their recommendations was to start doing things if you could. Now it's sort of still held to that 3 miscarriage standard, but also allowed for some intervention after 1 and even 2.
Right. Like that you could get it if you requested it, sort of a thing, as opposed to making you wait.
Because I do think that there's sort of this balance, right, of we can't overtrust medical science to fix everything. And in some ways, it is true that miscarriages are often sort of unstoppable. One of our tests revealed, that it was a chromosomal abnormality that wasn't necessarily going to be, couldn't have been fixed.
Right.
But even having that test and knowing that, I was really lucky that after my first 2, I had a doctor. It was a different doctor then. I had 2 doctors tell me it would be 3 before we did anything. But after my second, my doctor, who was a third doctor, said, we're going to start looking into this. And knowing that second one there was nothing we could do. It was a developmental abnormality. There was so much peace with that. Whereas my first miscarriage, we know we had a heartbeat. We saw the heartbeat at 8 weeks. And then later, after my third, we started treating my thyroid. Sometimes it is an easy solution. And not that would have saved the first, but that there was, like I said, I think it's a challenge that you don't want to assume doctors are not God.
Right.
But I think that there are but we also have to hold that intention with these are little souls and valuable beings. And I think it would be very strange if 3 of my children died before someone started investigating.
Exactly. And that's kind of how I felt, and then being told by family that it was no big deal wasn't particularly helpful. And I remember sitting there in that restaurant. Fortunately, I hadn't ordered yet because I had only had water, and then I got up and left. But I remember saying to Emily, you're going to grieve. Those were the only words that came to me, was you're going to grieve, which was sort of my way of saying, it's a death. There's a life that has stopped, and we need to walk through that. We need to walk through that together because we're all hurting. It was a big deal.
Why do you think that was it's just so interesting that was what they said. It's not a big deal. Do you think it just had something to do with the time, or the people didn't share about those sort of things? I don't know.
Yeah, I do. I think it was an instance of we're thinking 30 years ago, and I was almost 30. So, I was getting advice from someone much older that absolutely respected life, but just had seen such big things happen in their lives that they couldn't equate it. And I'm like, I'm not in a grief competition here.
Right.
All I know is I'm grieving.
Right.
Well, and I've said too, I really think that this knowledge, I think for eternity, we've realized that, or well, at least since man has been on this earth, that pregnancies are lives. It's very obvious when you feel this baby inside of you, and then they come out acting, mothers say, right, like this baby acts and moves the way they act and moved inside me. Like it's really crazy. That first moment when you hold a child on top of you and they're moving on top of your tummy the way they were moving inside your tummy, right? So I think we've known this forever, but I also think that there's we've talked about this before, technology has just really peeled back that veil, right? Like we can see how young they start to look like. We can see these heartbeat, can see this, or whatever you want to call it, fetal pulse or whatever you want to call it. You see these things start, the spark of life and the growth and
right. And me now being, I don't know, almost third trimester, every week I get a little update about this thing is developing and this thing is all these details about what's happening with the baby right at this moment. And my mom had always said that it was very uncommon to get an ultrasound back in the, the 80s.
You had to have a reason.
Right. And so
a very, very compelling reason.
Right. So there was, now there's sort of this standard.
We all hang them on our fridge and put them on Facebook, and we have ultrasounds of and you can get an ultrasound almost whenever you want now. I mean, there's obviously, medical reasons, but there's boutique ultrasound clinics, and even for not, they're so available. And I think that gives us, it doesn't change what we've always known, but sometimes seeing what we've known gives us an awareness and a more knowledge of, there are more tests. I had an early miscarriage that, had there not been modern testing, I would have never known was a miscarriage. And those are basic HCG testing, but that's even, in the last 50 to 100 years.
It is. And that was one of the things that was brought up to me by an older person, that, oh gosh, we all had miscarriages and didn't even know it. We didn't even know we were pregnant because they were 3 months before they even knew it,
Yeah.
So it's it's just not a big deal. And I'm like, but I did know it, and it is, and hormonally I was suffering, and and all that to say, I guess one of the things I longed for, and one of the things I longed for my daughter, was information.
Yes,
I'm an educator, so I like information. Information is power and control, right? And not to be self-reliant, not be able to let go and hand it over, but at the same time, when I've been diagnosed with other things, I've been handed packets of literature.
Right.
And I've been told what to expect. And I've been given a course of events. And with both of our miscarriages, it was very matter of fact. And a lot of words hitting us quickly that we weren't even sure what the decision was that we were making. So, I think as we waded through that, as Emily and I had some parallel grief and grieved together, we started having conversations about why is it this way?
Right. And then that was what launched that first gathering we had about there's a gap here. What is it and how can we fix it?
Everyone sort of came out with the same experience. And then it's even been the last, 10 years. So it was 9 years ago, a little over 9 years ago. It was about 9 years ago in November, my due date for that first miscarriage. But since then, it's just so crazy how much the conversations line up, how much the experiences line up. And I point back again to that UK study and just how many things, I think about that phone call. I don't remember what you said. It's so, grief is weird, right? Where there's just these moments that are imprinted like a movie. You can see them, you can hear them, you can smell them. And then there's other moments where you're like,
was I there?
Yeah. That's completely black to me. But I remember getting in the car and making the phone call. And I kind of deal with grief. Adam and I deal with it a little differently, where like I need to like spend that first day on the phone, but with like zero emotions, where I'm just going to like call everyone I know and then tell everyone, get through it. He wants some time alone. But I think one thing I can very much picture is like getting into the car, getting on the highway, like driving over this like huge steep bridge in Texas, and like that study about having a place. And I remember it was the appointment was at the end of the day, and
dinner time.
Yeah, I guess it was dinner time. Yeah. Well, in Texas is an hour. We were in Texas and you were in Ohio, so it would have been an hour behind. And I had made the appointment for like 4 or 4:30, so it could be like after work. And I hadn't really told everyone. I had told my boss, but I hadn't told anyone else. So I wanted to be able to like skip out of work without too much
questioning.
And so I remember there was no heartbeat in the exam room. And then they sent us immediately down. They had in-office ultrasounds. And so they sent us immediately down to the ultrasound tech. And it was the awful, like, you know, they do the external, then they do the internal, and then they couldn't. And then we were just sitting there waiting for the doctor to come tell us. And at this point, it was now after hours for the clinic. And they gave us all the time. He said, like, take all the time and space you need. But we're sitting in this ultrasound room where we just received horrible news and where we've been sitting. And I think, and then we just go out to the car, and then we just like sitting in the car staring. And then we, you know, I start making phone calls, and I think about that, like having bereavement space and having a place to go that isn't just sort of sitting in the car and driving mindlessly home.
We also were sitting in our car in our driveway when we called both of our parents. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I remember exactly like just sitting there and having to say it on the phone, and the grief of the grandparents, you know. But yeah, it's like that's what I remember, sitting in my driveway.
Yeah.
Like when you even go inside, we just sat in the driveway and made the phone call and then sat there. Yeah.
Well, you know, and you just made me think of something when you were talking about your coworkers not knowing that you were pregnant. My coworkers didn't know either. I was a teacher, and it was the end of the school year, so there was no reason to make a lot of noise about it. And when I miscarried, my doctor said, I want you home for at least a week. Of course, I had to call the principal and tell him. And of course, his immediate reaction was, well, I didn't even know you were pregnant.
Like,
and it's like, well, yeah. And I remember just asking him, please don't tell anybody what I'm going through. And I don't know why. I don't know why that was my response. I don't think I was particularly embarrassed that I was miscarrying, but I was overwhelmed and I felt lonely. And my co-teacher, she called me and she said, I heard it's very personal. And she was assuming it was something with my marriage. Oh. And I'm like, no.
My husband is still standing by me.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I told my boss the exact same thing. I told my boss and his wife what had happened, but I told them to tell my students that I had the flu. And this was, 2012. And only since then we started this group do I feel like, should it happen again, or I would encourage other people, like, if you want to, it's okay to tell people the reason. If you don't want to, that's fine. But I at the time felt like, well, people would think it's weird or something to know that about me, And again, they hadn't even known I was pregnant yet. So it was like this double whammy for my boss. Like, by the way, I was pregnant, but not anymore.
And there's no, I talked about how the hospitals at that time didn't hand us anything. There's also no calling hours. There's no grief processing time. Other family members I've lost to death, there's been time to talk and to remember. So there's this very, very, as my friend said, faceless grief.
Well, and I think we need to make, there's this tension that's always had, right, where it's, and I'm hearing you say this, with like, it's common, so it's no big deal. And I don't think those two have to follow. Death is coming too, and no one, we're all going to do it, right? Everyone's parents are going to die, and no one ever says, "Oh, I'm sorry, your mom died, mine did too."
Right,
it's no big deal.
It's no big deal.
We have this. We've always talked about the protocol for when your grandpa or your parent or a sibling dies, and
no one ever says, "I'm sorry, your grandpa died," but it's really no big deal. Grandpas die all the time,
Right.
and we have so it can simultaneously. We've talked too about. A little bit about like we have a bad relationship with death in the first place, I think now, because we do try to make it no big deal. We try to minimize funerals and we try to minimize like, oh, we don't want all that. And I think it's okay to say miscarriage is common, death is common. Both call for sadness, both call for deep sadness, and sadness can be common. I don't think we have to hold our sadness and our suffering. I think we're pretty detached from suffering too. And in some ways it's like, well, if I'm not having this like great suffering, and I think there is something to be said that like, of course, we live in a time with many comforts and many alleviated sufferings. And the expectation is that our children will live and not die of dysentery or fall up,
medical science will fix it all.
Right.
At the same time, I don't think we need to say because it's common, it means it
doesn't matter.
worthy of our suffering, and that suffering shouldn't be something of the human experience.
Right.
Right. And also realizing that that's going to be different for everyone. I mean, I found that with my husband and I, we were at very different places at the same time. One of us would be deeply sad when the other one was happy. And it was like, how dare you be happy? And then that one would turn sad. How dare you get sad because you were just happy? I mean, we were just at very different places. And I think the same thing happens when it's your child that's had loss. You're looking at it going, wait a minute, who are you today?
Right.
What is happening? I was just feeling better and now you're not. So I think, and particularly because we had a lot of miles between us, it was just particularly hard to know sort of what that emotional climate was, what that temperament was. And I've talked to others that said for them, they just went on. We have to accept that too, that we're all gonna manage it in different ways. But I think one of the greatest assets of Early Pregnancy Loss Association is we just don't want people to feel alone.
Yeah.
However they're walking through it. We want them to know that there's people out there that care and that there's support and that there's information for good decisions.
Well, and I think I don't think suffering and sadness, sometimes it does look like crippling anxiety or depression. And that is something I think people need to know occurs. But I think too, grief can be expressed and experienced in different ways by different people, depending on your own context and your own experience and your own personality. I mean, we talked a long time on our last episode, right, about the way spouses respond differently and how to care for your marriage and that. So I think it's important too to realize that like some might wail and cry on the floor, and that might be good and that might be a good release, and some might not.
And some days you might, and some days you might not.
Right. But that doesn't mean you're not grieving and not experiencing grief. And so I think
I recall about 2 months after our miscarriage, we were living in an apartment at graduate school, and my husband went into our little efficiency kitchen to make a peanut butter sandwich, and we'd had a nice day. We'd had a nice conversation about other things, and just kind of reaching that acceptance. And he went to make the peanut butter sandwich, and he came back out of the kitchen, and I was sitting on the floor just sobbing. And he's like, "When I left, you were okay. Like, what happened while I was gone?" And it was just, thoughts that had overwhelmed me. At that point, it was a lot of fear about what's next, about moving forward. And we would surprise each other every once in a while with just these outbursts of emotion. And he's like, can I eat my sandwich? Is that okay? What happened?
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, so we've talked about almost 40 years ago now, and we've talked about almost 10 years ago. And I know we sort of circled around this topic a lot. And, when we had Pastor Hennis on, we talked about sort of 40 years ago, 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, and then 10 years ago. Sort of what's your analysis of where things are now?
So I have been encouraged as we have worked through getting information out to people through blogs and podcasts on our website. I have been encouraged with the kits that have gone out and the messages that we get back from people that I think I often sort of put myself in their shoes and think how much that would have meant to me at the time. And I guess I'm breaking my arm, patting our backs. But the real encouragement for me came last week when I had a call from a hospital. We were connected in Ohio through Forget-Me-Not baskets, and they were looking for someone that provided materials for miscarriage, pre-20-week loss, but later than what our small kits would serve, the collection vessels and what to do with remains and all of those things. And I had a conversation with their nurse coordinator, bereavement coordinator. And one of the reasons I'm in Hillsdale today is to pick up some of our large kits to take them back to her. And this had grown out of some training that they were doing. And it's just becoming a movement.
Right.
And I just feel so encouraged right now and so hopeful that the climate has changed. I was encouraged several years ago when we went to the PLIDA conference and people were so interested in our things, people being emergency room nurses and perinatal nurses and so forth. But it feels like it's going the next step, that the hospitals are now beginning to ask, what can we do?
Right. It's like a twofold change. They're like, one, providers knowing they need to provide this somehow, like information and resources, and then there being a place for them to get it, and then all of a sudden we're connected. It's like, hey, I know someone who does that. So we're suddenly like making this connection where for years there was no connection.
They've recognized the gap. Her comment to me was that people were asking, what they could do with the remains, and they were being told to take them back to the doctor's office, and the doctor's office were saying, unless we're doing testing, this isn't a good alternative.
Right.
So all of that kind of wove into this. We need a system, we need a protocol, and we need to.
Yep.
They're recognizing the gap and that we need to provide.
Right.
For this.
And not leaving it up to people to go scour the internet to figure that out themselves.
Yes.
Yeah. And I don't know exactly what changed, if not just sort of awareness by a lot of groups. It is certainly not just our voice out there. There's a lot of voices out there. Because when I asked that first miscarriage and I said, what's going to happen to me? And, he laid out my options. We can do a DNC. We can wait for things to go naturally. If things aren't going naturally enough, then you can do, the medications or fast enough. And we were getting ready to move across the country in 3 weeks. So I had a picture that this was going to be more than a heavy period, because I remember saying, but I said, like, what's it going to be like? And everyone is different. This is the thing that really frustrates me. And now, how many women have I talked to over the last 10 years? Hundreds, probably, when you consider conferences and my job. How many women have I told? Like, everyone is different, but also not that different, and I sat through an entire 9-hour class or whatever about having a baby, and every experience on that is different too, but at least you could tell me the basics on. And, so.
And we know if you miscarry at 8 weeks, it's going to be different than 12 weeks. It's going to be different than 20 weeks.
And so he still pretty much said it was going to be a heavy period. And I said, and I'm trying to make my decision. Should I do the DNC or should I wait to go naturally? I said, do we know when it would start? And of course the answer is no, we don't know when it would start. And I was just picturing myself, like, we're driving from Texas to Michigan, like being in an Arkansas truck stop. If you've ever driven to Arkansas, like, there's not even truck stops. I mean, like, and I remember on that same trip, we decided I said, let's get north of Little Rock and then we'll stop for lunch when we were moving home. And we got north of Little Rock and, like, there was nothing. We ended up eating, like, catfish it was an Arkansas truck stop, which it was fine. But it was very
fine for dinner, not where you want to miscarry.
Yeah, right.
So that's what I pictured. But he still didn't. But it was still sort of like, yeah, no, that would be bad. I agree. You should probably do a DNC. And that was the right thing at the time. I don't regret the DNC. But I bring up this story to say he did not prepare me for what I would be experiencing. Or do I think even realizing, like, yeah, you might need a receptacle. And we've
Mhm.
talked about this a million times. Like, but even my second miscarriage, where I was way more prepared. And then the doctor spent the night on the phone with Adam as we were walking through this, like, okay, how much blood is she losing? But there was no sort of acknowledgement that I would need anything more than a few pads.
Right.
And
and then in doing our focus groups, there were so many that commented on the baby being called a product of conception and medical waste and just really hurtful terms that. And it was interesting because when I was having this conversation with this nurse last week and I shared that with her, she was appalled. And I thought,
Oh, wow.
thank you.
yeah, I think we've come a long way. I think that's we keep concluding there. And I think there's more work to be done and to keep, I was just looking at our care kit numbers. I think we've distributed something like 8 the first year of our large care kits. Our small care kits are different plane of numbers here, but our large care kits that really tend to when a miscarriage experiences. I think we distributed something like 8 the first year, 2 the next year, 20. Last year we had a great year at like almost 40. This year we've distributed 78 already. We're on track to maybe distribute 100 this year. Now, like I said, our small kits then too, like those numbers are at like 20, 100, 600, 1,200 each year we keep. But I think a lot of that has been, we have more doctors and hospitals reaching out, realizing that this is what's needed, more friends reaching out, realizing that this is a significant event. And it is one you can recover and grow from. And it won't always feel as hard as it feels in that moment, like any grief. So,
but like other, when your grandpa dies, there's that immediate procedure, right? Like with the funeral home and stuff. And so we're sort of getting more to the place where there can be this immediate procedure,
exactly,
where we can have those connections. And that's a big step.
And I remember in the early days talking about just a desire to change the social script.
Yes.
And that's what it is. And when she's talking about the small kits and the large kits, those small kits are very appropriate for that earlier loss. But when you are to the point of being able to find the remains, we really want to promote the larger kits. And we've said many times, they're kind of gritty. They're kind of hard to think about. They're kind of hard to talk about. But it certainly tells the woman the story that when they receive it, that something big is about to happen.
Right.
I guess, again, one of the differences between my miscarriage and my daughter's miscarriage was mine happened much earlier. I was probably about 8 weeks pregnant. She was 12. So it was a different physical experience. And I have to say, I was shocked by what she went through because nobody ever really told us.
Right.
So I just want it to be handled like other major medical issues where they don't keep those things a surprise.
Right. Yes. Well, and I think we are seeing that changing. So.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Mom.
I was glad to do that.
I'm glad to have you on. And yeah, I think it's a good perspective. And I've appreciated how we've grown sort of intergenerationally, and we're working on continuing to bring in, our board has realized too that as we continue to age, I think it's an important intergenerational experience and care for. And I think there's a real need and good things that can come from sort of those ages of wisdom.
And I just want to say, as the grandma on the board, because I am the only grandma on the board, I just want to say to the grandparents out there, if you're going through this with a child or an in-law, just give them space, let them listen and listen to them and let them know they're not alone.
I think that's really good.
Thank you for listening to Hope Blooms, a podcast from the Early Pregnancy Loss Association.
To learn more about how we and you can support women suffering early pregnancy loss, visit our website at miscarriagecare.com or find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you for listening.